Today I'm going to be making a new sourdough starter. And this is a really easy method that only requires water and flour. Now I learned this method from a book called The Vintage Remedies Guide to Bread, and I'll put a link to that book down in the description box below. So for this recipe, or this sourdough starter, you use water. I'm using a spring water or bottled water. You could also use filtered water. I wouldn't recommend using tap water though, unless that's the only option you have, because I've read that the chlorine that's sometimes in tap water could potentially kill the yeast or inhibit it from growing well. And then for flour, I have an all-purpose wheat flour. This is an unenriched, unbleached flour. I've heard some people have used whole wheat flour for sourdough starters. I haven't tried it personally. I've only ever used the all-purpose. And then I'm using a large quart-sized mason jar to keep mine in. And I like using the wide mouth ones because they are a lot easier when you have to stir your starter when you're feeding it. And then I put a piece of cheesecloth over the top. This one is a little bit of a wider weave than I like. When you can find it, the tighter the weave of your cheesecloth, the less likely it will be in the summer for fruit flies to get in. But this is what I have for today, so this is what I'm going to use. And then you just need the ring from a canning jar. You don't need the regular lid part. All right, so I have about a half a cup of flour, I would say. I usually don't measure my flour. I usually just use this scoop that I have and scoop in the flour container, just a couple of those. It doesn't have to be exact, but approximately half a cup. And then that goes in the jar, and making a mess usually happens. And then for water, I don't measure that either. Usually I pour it in until it gets to just the right consistency. And I have to grab my spoon. And then I just mix that together, adding a little bit more water if necessary. And then if it ends up being too runny, too much water, I add a little bit more flour if I need to. But I think this is just about right. Basically, you want the consistency to be thicker than a cake batter or a pancake batter, but not quite as thick as a biscuit dough or scone dough or something like that. So you can kind of see the consistency there where it doesn't just run right off the spoon, but it still kind of pours a little bit. So just a little bit thick like that. It should be not too difficult to stir. You don't want it quite that thick. All right, and then what you do is just put the cheesecloth over the top and then cover it or twist on the canning ring. And then just leave it out. This is easier said than done. Sometimes you have to kind of play around with the cheesecloth a little bit to get the ring to go on right. All right, then leave it out on the counter somewhere at room temperature for just about 24 hours. Doesn't have to be an exact time, just whenever the next day that you can get around to feeding it. And you do exactly the same thing with the flour and water. So I will check back in and feed mine tomorrow. So on day 2, I did the same exact thing with feeding, where I did approximately a half a cup of flour and then added just enough water to get that same consistency that was thicker than a cake batter or a pancake batter, but not quite as thick as something like a biscuit dough. And so this is day 3, and I wanted to show you here, you can see how it's starting to form some bubbles on the inside. This is before I fed it for the day. So it is starting to do something. It's starting to get a little bit active. I wouldn't try baking with it yet, but I'm excited to see that it's at least getting some bubbles started. And I did notice also that when I smelled it, it's starting to smell just a little bit sour. When I smelled it yesterday, it mostly just smelled like flour. So it's starting to do something now, and I'm going to feed it the same exact way today and then check back again tomorrow. So this is day 4, and you can see looking in, you see there's definitely some bubbles happening in there. I think the bubbles seem a little bigger today than they did yesterday. And when you look at the side of the jar, it might be a little hard to see, but I can see some bubbles starting to form on the side of the jar too. So I'm going to feed it again today exactly the same way as I did yesterday, and then we'll check back again tomorrow and see how it's doing. Okay, this is day 5 now, and it's just about 24 hours after I had fed my starter, approximately anyways, and I can definitely see some bubbles inside. I can see a little bit on the side of the jar. It's easier to see them looking inside though. And my starter has risen some since yesterday. and it smells slightly sour to me. Not a very strong sour smell, but it definitely has a little bit of a slight sour tang to it, mixed in with a flour smell. And I think it's ready for me to try baking with. I think I'm going to mix up a loaf of bread tonight, let it rise overnight, and see how it does in the morning when I bake it. Okay, so this is the next day now, and last night I made up my bread dough and let it rise overnight and during the morning, and I baked my bread this afternoon. And I did notice that it seemed to take longer to rise than it usually does when I make the same type of bread. I'm not sure if that's because my sourdough starter just isn't quite as active yet since it's a newer starter, or if it's because the temperature in the house has been cooler lately. But either way, my bread dough did rise. It didn't rise quite as much as it usually does when I make the same loaf of bread, but it's still a perfectly fine loaf of bread and it tasted great. I had some earlier. So I think that by the time I make bread again next time, I think that the starter will be more established and more ready to bake with and the bread will rise better. I probably should have waited another day or two before trying to make bread, but this was still good enough and it was a perfectly fine loaf of bread. And if anyone's interested in trying this type of bread, it's a very easy sandwich sourdough loaf of bread. It's really simple to make. It's an old recipe from the 19th century that I adapted a little bit, and I just do everything all in one bowl, so I even kind of knead it lightly in the bowl, so there's no mess on the counter to clean up. There's no extra dishes to wash. It's really easy. I just make it up in the evening, let it rise overnight, and then it's ready to bake the next day. So if you're interested in checking out that bread recipe, I'll put the link down below. Alright, so this is a week later now, and I thought I'd just give you an update to show you what my bread looked like the second time I tried making a loaf of bread with this new sourdough starter. This is my loaf of bread, and it did rise a little bit more for me this time. This seems to me to be normal for how I usually expect this recipe to look when I make bread. And what I did was I fed my starter consistently just about every other day. So I made my first loaf of bread on a Wednesday. I mixed up the dough Wednesday night, let it rise overnight, and baked it on Thursday. And after using the starter to make the dough, I fed it on Wednesday night. Then I fed it again on Friday, on Sunday, and on Tuesday. And Tuesday was my last feeding before I used it to bake this loaf of bread. And I'll include a picture here to show you what my starter looked like on the day I used it for baking bread again. It was more active, it had more bubbles in it, it had risen further. So I think that I was a little bit premature on using it on day 5. I would recommend, if you can, waiting until day 6 or 7, because my starter was close. It was still ready enough to make bread. It was still an okay loaf of bread, but it would have been better if I had just given it another couple of days to keep rising. So I would recommend feeding it consistently every day for about 6 to 7 days, and then you can reduce the feedings to approximately every other day. And I have some more information about how I take care of my starter, how I maintain it, and tips for feeding it and everything like that. I have that in the blog post that goes along with this video. I have some links to some other articles about sourdough care, so you can find that information there if you want to check that out. And thank you for joining me today. I hope to see you again next time.